Out of the way!
FireEmblemEngage marks the 17th entry in the long-running series, and the final result is interesting. When the game was announced back in 2022, my initial impressions echoed the same as many other fans. I wasn't too keen on the art style, the new mechanics seemed fun but a little broken, and the story trailers didn't exactly inspire confidence. But when the game finally released, it wound up being a pleasant surprise. Engage marked a bold step forward in terms of strategy-based gameplay, and as an SRPG, it's a treat for series veterans and newcomers alike. But while Engage succeeds in many areas, it also falters just as much. Ever since Awakening, Fire Emblem has struggled with its storytelling, and while Three Houses was a step in the right direction, Engage is yet another step backwards. Engage features a combination of strong gameplay, but a weak story, and if you're a longtime series fan, that sentiment probably sounds very familiar. There's a lot to love about Engage, and a lot to dislike, and honestly, that might as well be a series tradition at this point. When it comes to Engage, it's best to start with the aspect that garners the most praise: the gameplay. Engage is the first entry since Fates to focus on mechanics, map design, and strategy, and there's been an attempt to balance and redesign many previous mechanics of the series. The first example of this is class diversity and Imbalance, which has been a recurring issue throughout the series. Not all Fire Emblem classes are created equally, and it's very common to have certain classes dominate certain games, like how FE4 and FE9 are very cavalier-centric. And while Engage does still have this issue to an extent, there's an attempt to give many classes more of a niche. Armor units have better movement and can use their bulk more effectively, while magic units can function as wall breakers or support units. And most of the infantry units have skills that give them a unique role in the army, like how halberdiers have access to guaranteed follow-ups, or how heroes can offer an insane damage boost to your entire party. Of course, Engage's class balance still isn't perfect, and some classes, like say Swordmasters, Berserkers, and Paladins, feel undertuned compared to their peers. But the classes overall feel really diverse, and while you could stack your army with cavalry and flyers like past games, you will be rewarded for having a diverse army. And adding to class diversity is the addition of the break mechanic, which is a rework of the weapon triangle. In Engage, if you attack an enemy with a weapon that beats theirs in the weapon triangle, you'll break them, which prevents them from countering in that combat, as well as the next round. And the break mechanic is such a cool way to buff the weapon triangle. While the weapon triangle is another series staple, its actual relevance can vary depending on the game, and there are some games where it barely feels like a relevant mechanic. But the break mechanic gives players an actual incentive to use different weapons. Being able to break an enemy allows you to push your offense, but in a way that's fairly safe and reliable. And the reverse of this is that enemies can break you as well. Instead of just going head empty and throwing your squad into the battlefield, it's usually in your best interest to be mindful of enemy compositions and plan a strategy accordingly. The break mechanic acts as a buff to both the player phase and the enemy phase, and if you use it to your advantage, you can make some really aggressive plays. But if you aren't careful, one mistake or lapse in attention can result in a death or two. And as much as Engage changes up older mechanics, the game's real defining feature is the Engage mechanic itself. By drawing on the power of legendary heroes, units gain a wide range of abilities, including, but not limited to, increased stats, unique skills, and powerful attacks. Every emblem has a unique role or niche, with some being more offense-oriented, while others are more defensive or supportive in nature. Now, at first glance, many of the emblems seem downright broken, and that's true to an extent. Some emblems are really strong, with Micaiah's staff utility being one example, and Lucina's bondage shield, Violet's genealogy dance, and Corrin's dreadful aura all being really strong as well. But one of my favorite things about Engage is that it actually feels balanced around the emblem's power. On the higher difficulty settings, enemy units are strong and plentiful, not to mention the numerous boss fights within the game. While stats and skills will help, you are encouraged to take advantage of every tool available, and the emblems will often be the cornerstones of your strategy. And the fact that Engage feels balanced around the emblems is what really makes the game for me. I played Engage the first time on hard, and while it did feel a little easy at times, it overall felt like a good setting for most players. But for my second and third playthroughs, I played on Maddening, and oh man. I didn't even plan on touching Maddening at first, since some games, like Three Houses on Maddening, can be straight up not fun at times. But with Engage, Maddening felt fantastic. Almost every time something went wrong, it was because I as a player screwed up, and there was always a better way I could have approached a situation. The enemies on Maddening do not mess around, and even though the game threw a ton of challenges at me, it always felt like there was a way out. And to me, that's the key to making Maddening, and by extension, the game itself, so much fun. Contrary to my early impressions, Engage isn't a game where you steamroll using broken mechanics. If anything, you need the emblems to survive, and you're expected to take full advantage of every mechanic to claim victory. But as good as the gameplay is, it's not without some issues, many of which are really minor. For one, the unit balance in this game is in a weird spot, especially when you add in the limited deployment slots. You gain access to units like Kagetsu and Pandreo around the mid-game, and their bases are so good, they'll likely match or surpass most of your army. And around the mid-game, not only are deployment slots really limited, but everyone is begging for the location of seals and other resources, and there's not enough to go around until further in the game. On a purely statistical basis, it's hard to justify using the early characters unless they're really blessed, and unless you're really attached to the early characters, there's a chance most playthroughs wind up like the Banshees of Inisherin.
I just don't like you no more.
The series is no stranger to unit imbalance or limited deployment, with FE6 being a good example of the former, and Three Houses being a good example of the latter. But for me personally, I'd have liked to see the early characters have a bit more of a niche. As it stands, the only real advantage they have are the skills of the first 6 emblems, and while that is a really strong advantage, it might not be enough in comparison to the raw stats of the later units. And I should reiterate that again, this is a really minor issue, and it's one that's really manageable with time. Radiant Dawn has even weirder unit balance and resource management, and you can make anyone good in that game with a little bit of effort. Engage is very similar in this regard, and like pretty much every other game in the series, there's always a way to make every unit viable. As for the other main issue with Engage, it'd be regarding its map design. Now, the map design in this game is actually really good, and I personally think it's some of the best we've had since Conquest. Many maps feature a wide variety of layouts, side objectives, and thoughtful design, which is more than you can say for some entries. Some standouts include maps like Chapter 17, which is a boss rush of multiple zones, and a combination of aggressive and passive enemies. This map is easily one of the best boss rushes in the series, and if you don't manage your aggression or plan a solid strategy, you're gonna have a tough time weathering the onslaught. But for the map design overall, I'd have preferred a few more maps with varied objectives. Defeating the enemy commanders is a dominant main objective in the game, and while the maps and bosses are well designed, having the same objective over and over makes the game feel a little stagnant. Some of the more memorable maps, like for example, Chapter 11, feature unique objectives, and I'd have liked to see just a bit more experimentation like that. I think the addition of, say, a proper defend map, a classic objective like Seize, or something brand new entirely, would have gone a long way to adding more variety. But most of these so-called issues are really minor, and are also mostly personal nitpicks. There's a lot of other minor gripes I have, like the return of a hub world, lack of paired endings, and so on and so forth. But none of them take away from the core gameplay by any means. I've liked the sandboxes and RPG elements as much as the next person, but it's been a long time since the series pushed tactics and strategy to the forefront, and Engage absolutely delivers in that regard. While it's fun for a game to present a myriad of tools, I think it's even more fun when it encourages you to use those tools, even if the encouragement isn't exactly gentle. Engage is filled with those moments where you look at the map and think, man, how on earth can I get through this? And then all of a sudden, you have an epiphany, and you come up with just the idea that brings you one step closer to victory. However, as much as I could praise the gameplay, that praise doesn't extend to the game's writing, namely with its story and characters. When it comes to Engage's character writing, it resembles Awakening and Fate's more than Three Houses, which can be a good or bad thing depending on your preference. But in general, most of Engage's characters can be summed up as follows. Terrible first impressions. Let's take Ivy for example. She's introduced as an antagonist around Chapter 8, and the minute I saw her intro cutscene, I immediately thought, great, another one of those characters. But once you play through the game a little more, you'll see that Ivy is actually a really solid character. Not only does she have a small arc in the main story, but there's a fun dichotomy between Ivy the future leader and Ivy the massive dork. I don't think there's a single Ivy support I dislike, and she's far and away one of my favorite characters in the game. And being a very strong unit doesn't hurt either. And Ivy is just one example, and one of the less extreme ones. Characters like Alchrist and Saline seem really one note at first, but once you get past that first impression, you see aspects to their personality that are way more interesting. Now, this isn't to say that all the characters in Engage are like this, and it's more accurate to say that the character writing overall is very hit and miss. For example, most of the early characters are guilty of being one note, while the Brodian characters tend to have solid writing across the board. And by the time you get to Solm, the writing tends to average out, with characters like Marin, Panette, and Pandreo being solid characters, while others feel a little more shallow. But you only get one chance at a first impression, and as far as Engage goes, it can be hard to shake that initial first impression. And most of those weak first impressions will be resolved if the game leaned less on tropey writing, and added more substance to the early supports. Most of the game's stronger characters are ones that don't rely on quirks or tropes as much, and almost every character has something that makes them feel fleshed out. The Faraway Royals in particular are great examples of this, as they both have many supports focused on specific traits, but also have a few that showcase additional depth. If the Faraway Royals had more supports that explored aspects like, say, Saline's views as a ruler, or Alfred's struggle with illness, it'd go a long way to giving players a much better first impression. Of course, your perspective on Engage's characters will come down to your preferences. Characters like Ivy and Diamant are some of the best new additions to the series, and a few others have slowly grown on me as well. In fact, there's a lot of supports that are not only really interesting, but genuinely funny as well. And if your opinions on the cast don't change much over time, that's fine too. It can be hard to look past some of the character writing, and if you're a fan who already wasn't keen on the style of Awakening or Fates, Engage probably won't change your mind. As for the story of Engage, it definitely is a story. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, Engage's story is by far its weakest aspect, and depending on who you ask, it's either serviceable or one of the weakest stories in the series. As for the story itself, it begins with the awakening of the Divine Dragon, Alir. Alear wakes up with no memory of their past, and it isn't long until they're introduced to another dragon named Lumera, who claims to be their mother. Lumera explains to Alear that the return of the fell dragon, Sombron, is approaching, and in order to defeat him, they need to travel the world and collect the Emblem rings, which should give them enough power to defeat Sombron. But before Alear can properly set out on their journey, Lumera's castle is attacked by Sombron's forces, and even though Alear is able to fend them off briefly, the battle ends with Lumera sacrificing herself to save Alear. For the record, this is about when I gave up any hope for the story, but more on that later. After Lumera's death, the next few chapters revolve around Alear's journey to find the Emblem rings. But during their journey, Alear meets a mysterious girl named Vale, and the two form a brief friendship before Alear continues their quest. A few chapters later, Alear and their party have finally gathered enough strength to face the enemy, and even though it looks like victory is within reach, Alear is caught off guard by the appearance of Vale, who reveals herself to be the same person who killed Lumera and a daughter of Sombron. Vale is then able to gain the upper hand and steal Alear's rings, which forces Alear and their army to retreat. Following that brutal defeat, Alear spends the next part of the story gathering more allies and rings, and the next major story beat occurs in chapter 17. In this chapter, it's revealed that Vale actually has two personalities inside her, the kind, gentle person Alear befriended, and the evil servant of Sombron. Alear and Vale's forces then engage in a grueling battle, and by the end, the encounter ends with both Alear's victory and the faintest hope that Vale can be saved. After chapter 17, the next major story beat occurs around chapter 20. Another antagonist reveals that Alear is actually a fell dragon, and their father is none other than Sombron himself, which also makes Vale their sibling by blood. While this revelation does distress Alear, they kind of just get over it, and by the next chapter, Alear is ready to face Sombron once again. Alear and Vale's forces then engage in another battle, with Alear being victorious once again. But in the aftermath, Vale is able to overpower her dark side and turn against her father, which in turn causes Sombron to attack her. But before Vale's turned into space dust, Alear steps in and saves her, losing their life in the process. Alear is then revived by Vale's magic, and shortly after, dies. Again. But upon seeing Alear's strength of character, Martha and the others enact a special power to revive Alear, and they return to the world as the 13th Emblem, also known as the FireEmblem. After this point, the rest of the story is your standard JRPG fare. After a few more battles, Alear and their company reach Sombron, defeat him, and everyone lives happily ever after. Well, almost everyone. That summary skipped a few details here and there, but that's the general story of Engage. And at first glance, it's not outright terrible, but it's far from anything special. If you compare Engage's story to others in the series, it wouldn't be the worst, but it'd most likely be in the bottom 5, right alongside the Fates trilogy. And honestly, the only reason why it isn't the worst is because certain aspects of Engage elevate the story ever so slightly. The presentation is leagues ahead of games like Fates and Three Houses, and you can really tell that all the VAs are giving it their best. And for as generic as the story can be, there are aspects that sound great on paper. Alear has a unique backstory for a series lord, and Vale as a character serves many roles in the narrative, like a foil to Alear, an antagonist, and later, a deuteragonist. But that's where most of the positives end. The issues with Engage's story are many, and they include everything from amateurish dialogue, telling over showing, characters with plot-induced stupidity, contrived storytelling. You get the idea. Many of these issues aren't exclusive to Engage either, and they're part of a much longer, broader discussion about Fire Emblem storytelling in general. But that's a conversation worth having another day. And as much as I'd like to do a deep dive on Engage's story, I think we'd both end that conversation losing a few brain cells in the process. Hell, I practically lost a few getting stunlocked in how to script this section. Instead, if I could summarize the single, biggest issue with Engage's story, it would be this: pacing. This game's story is far too rushed, and you can sense it as early as Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is when Lumera is killed, and on paper, it's a generic but serviceable story beat. Fire Emblem parents don't exactly get to retire gracefully, and for the sake of the story, it does add a sense of danger to the narrative. Except by this point in the story, we've only gotten to know Lumera for, at most, 3 chapters, and that's being very generous. Alear is clearly distressed over Lumera's death, but we, the players, have zero reason to feel invested in her character or her relationship with Alear. And because we don't care about Lumera, her death ends up feeling like this boring scene that drags on way too long. I know dead parents are basically a series staple, but if the story spent more time on Lumera, there's a chance her death, and later, resurrection, might have been a little more meaningful. And you could say similar things about one of the game's central characters. At first glance, Vale offers a lot of potential in the story, and the very nature of her character is one that practically writes itself. You can even see a similar example in, say, Katarina from FE12. But Vale never quite lives up to her potential, and that's partially due to how quickly the game tries to establish her role. Vale's friendship with Alear begins in Chapter 4, but friendship is a very strong word to use in this scenario, as the two share very few scenes prior to Chapter 10. And when Chapter 10 arrives, Vale's betrayal is treated as an emotional gut punch, and it's one of the factors that make Chapter 10 Alear's darkest hour. But at the same time, Vale's betrayal lacks any impact whatsoever. Just like with Lumera's death, the story didn't spend enough time on Vale or her friendship with Alear, which means Vale's betrayal doesn't hit as hard as the story wants you to believe. The story treats Vale's betrayal as a dramatic moment, but as far as we're concerned, Vale's just some hobo Alear talked to like twice, 3 times if you include Lumera's murder. Just like Lumera's relationship with Alear, Vale's friendship with Alear is extremely rushed, and it ruins what could have been a very dramatic, emotional moment in the story. And you can see all of this come to fruition around chapter 21, which is a cornucopia of rushed pacing and mishandled story beats. In this chapter, Alear sacrifices himself to save Vale, and it's meant to be a direct callback to how Lumera did the same for Alear. Alear's death, or rather, deaths, triggered their return as an emblem, and the story treats this as a heroic moment for Alear. But nothing about chapter 21 feels earned at all. The Lumera callback means nothing because Lumera's death meant nothing, and Alear doing a piccolo means nothing because it's the culmination of a friendship that barely exists in the first place. But if the story spent time getting the audience invested in Lumera, Vale, and like a dozen other plot points, there's a chance Alear's sacrifice and revival could have meant something. Engage is chock full of moments where it presents a plot point or revelation, but fail to actually develop those story beats in a meaningful way. You can't have scenes where a character dies, or villains reveal their hidden feelings and motivations, and expect the audience to care out of the blue. Those moments need to be developed organically throughout the story, and if those story beats aren't developed properly, every feeling the story tries to elicit will fall short. Scenes that are meant to be emotional feel dull, shocking revelations feel muted, and the entire story just winds up feeling boring at best. In order for a story to really resonate with an audience, it needs both setup and payoff, and when it comes to Engage, it's a story that has a lot of payoff, but not nearly enough setup. And as much as I could criticize the story, there are moments where you can see flickers of potential. The tragedy of losing someone who came back into your life, the inner struggle of good and evil, or familial love overcoming all obstacles. All of those are fantastic ideas, and countless other stories have used similar concepts and thrived. And I'd have liked to see a version of Engage where it actually took time to get players invested in the story. Now, I want to reiterate that pacing is far from the only issue with Engage's story, and fixing the pacing isn't the silver bullet that solves every problem. As I mentioned earlier, this story suffers from so many different issues, and man, do I have some choice words about them. Seriously, the series is over 3 decades old, and it needs to move past using magic to artificially create conflict. I swear, the moment I got to chapter 17 and saw the explanation for Vale's split personality, I was gonna become the goddamn Joker. But that aside, if I could fix just one thing about Engage's story, it would easily be its pacing. Imagine, if you will, a version of Engage where you actually got to spend time with Lumera and Vale. They could be playable for the first 9 chapters, have more story cutscenes, or maybe even supports with the entire cast. Then chapter 10 happens, and everything plays out just like the original game, but with the addition of Lumera's murder by Vale's hands. That small change could be enough to add weight to Lumera's death, Vale's betrayal, and give the story the emotional core it desperately needs. Would a story like that be a great one? Honestly, who knows? Fixing the pacing is only one potential solution, but I do think it'd be a step in the right direction. The actual story of Engage needs a ton of revisions, and the more I think about it, the best way to describe the story is that it feels half-baked. So many parts of this story feel cluttered, rushed, and otherwise underwritten, as if the writers made a list of bullet points, but never went back to connect each point in a way that felt cohesive or satisfying. There most likely is a good story in there, but it requires a lot of effort to bring that story out. And if you're someone who enjoys Engage's story for what it is, that's totally fine. There's a place for lighter stories like Engage, and it's always okay to like things in spite of their flaws. And even though I spent ample time on Engage's story, honestly, it's barely an inconvenience for me. As I've gotten older, I realize I don't play Fire Emblem for the story as much, and the story is usually secondary to gameplay for me. I can overlook an average story if the gameplay is solid, whereas I find the opposite to be more difficult. And for that reason, I'd personally rate Engage very highly. It's just short of being in my top 5 games in the series, and there's a chance it could reach that upper echelon in the future. Engage is a blast to play, and because of that, it's very easy for me to look past the weak writing. But that is just my opinion, and the truth is that every Fire Emblem fan loves the series for different reasons. And while I'm someone who values gameplay over story, I feel immense sympathy for fans who feel the opposite, or value both story and gameplay equally. Being a fan of the series is like being on a roller coaster at times, and one that's more frustrating than exciting. Stories have been hit or miss ever since Awakening, and while Three Houses was a step in the right direction, it was also a step backwards in terms of gameplay. Then Engage rolls around, and it's very much the exact opposite. In my opinion, the last entries with strong stories and gameplay were the Tellius games, and there's an argument that the Arcanea duology qualifies as well. But in every single one of those cases, it's been over a decade since the series had a game with a good story and gameplay, and frankly, that's downright embarrassing. So many other series illustrate that it's possible to balance both story and gameplay, and while many haven't reached the same success as Fire Emblem, they're shining examples of what SRPGs are capable of. And it's sad that we're at a point where fans are constantly looking back. Fire Emblem stories were never the height of great storytelling, and many of them have the exact same issues as Engage. Telling over showing, contrived plot points, generic storylines, All of those are as much series staples as Jagans and Christmas Calves. But at the very least, older games had stories that respected the player's intelligence. It's not wrong to expect more from a franchise if those expectations are reasonable, and asking for a story that respects our intelligence isn't that unreasonable. And at the end of the day, Engage is another entry that serves as a reminder of how far the series has come, and a reminder of how much further it needs to go. But to end things on a more positive note, this game can be incredible at its high points. There's genuine love and reverence for the entire series in Engage, and one of my favorite parts of Engage is when you can feel that passion come through. The little details that older fans will catch, the insane remixes of classic themes, or those moments where you can see past and present merge together. Moments like that make me proud to be a Fire Emblem fan, and as someone who's grown alongside the series, that's the most I could ever ask for. Engage isn't the game for everyone, and if you're someone who found yourself not enjoying it, that's more than fair. But if it's any consolation, the series has had steady improvements over the years, and if IS can finally nail the balance between gameplay and storytelling, maybe someday Fire Emblem will finally have a true masterpiece to call their own.